Well, good morning. For those of you who I haven't had a chance to meet, my name is Rachel, and I lead the family ministries here at City North. Pastor Andrew and Vanessa are away this weekend. We are praying, getting lots of rest and restoration, which is, something God promises us that He will meet us in rest, and He created us for rest, so we pray that for them. And as Karina said on the screen, we are going through a message series that is going to be 31 weeks long. Yes, that is like most of a year. That is what we're doing. We're really excited about it. And it is called The Story, based on a book called The Story, where they have taken the stories of the Bible and they have kind of broken them up into their pieces and reordered them and put out this book that puts the story of the Bible in chronological order and more like a novel. And the reason they did that is to help us Western believers in the 21st century understand the big picture story of the Bible the way that we tell stories. It's just different than the way ancient Israel told stories. And so our goal for this is just to help us begin to see the big story that God has been telling from the beginning, that He is continuing to tell, and He will tell until the end of time. And so 2 weeks ago, we started the first movement. I believe if you have the story book, it is called The Story of the Garden, where God created the upper story and the lower story. His upper story was always existing, and He created this lower story where He wanted to live with mankind, and He created this earth to sustain and support them, and He walked with them faithfully and abided with them. But mankind rejected His plan for His creation, and so sin entered the world, and God couldn't abide with His creation the way that He really wanted to. And so there was this separation, and God said, I am going to build a rescue plan. I am going to launch a plan that gets us back to that original place of abiding, that original place where we live with God in a garden. And so last week, we continued with the first step in the rescue plan. God begins His plans by calling a man called Abraham to leave his current country and go to a land He would show him, and that He would make him into a great nation that would bless the whole earth. And to prove that, He did a covenant with Abraham. We talked a lot about that last week. A covenant is a legally binding agreement. And He made that promise to Abraham, but He made that promise to all of Abraham's descendants, his sons, Isaac and Jacob. And God's promise, God's legally binding agreement, was also included this almost like clause that said, hey, this rescue plan is going forward. I am going to keep my side of the bargain, even if you can't keep your side of the agreement. Even if these chosen people called by God couldn't keep their side, God is going to keep this rescue plan going. So this week, we are going to talk about Jacob's son, Joseph. And if you have been here at City North for a while, we did just do a 5-week series on the entirety of Joseph's life. So thank you, Pastor Andrew, for giving me the message that he's already done 5 messages on. So we do not have time to go into every single thing of Joseph's life. Andrew spent 5 weeks on it. But what that means for you guys is if the story fascinates you, you want to go deeper, the entire message series is on YouTube. We go really deep into the details of Joseph's life, some of the stories I'm not going to be able to get to today, so you guys can go catch up on that on YouTube. But to set the scene for Joseph's life, I think we have to talk a little bit about his father, Jacob, and we did not have time to talk about that last week. But Jacob is kind of known as being a trickster. He is known for manipulating people. He actually manipulated his father, and cheated his older brother Esau out of his inheritance. And when Esau was a little bit upset about that and threatened to kill him, Jacob ran away, and he settled in a country far away with his mother's family. And there he fell in love with a woman named Rachel. And Rachel's father didn't mind Jacob, he was fine, but he didn't want Rachel to get married without her older sister Leah getting married first. And so the girl's father actually tricked Jacob into marrying both women. So we have 2 sisters married to one man. And this was not uncommon in the Bible, but the Bible tells us that Jacob loved Rachel and he despised Leah. This was not an equal relationship between all of them. And that really began to create some animosity between the sisters. In fact, like the entire chapter of Genesis chapter 30 is just like explaining this tension between the two sisters. And because Jacob loved Rachel and despised Leah, God actually gave Leah a lot of children as a consolation for that, but he only gave Rachel 2 children. And so this family that is supposed to be God's family of promise, there's just this sense of like competition and manipulation and grasping. And even though this family knew they are God's chosen people, they are only a couple generations removed from God like coming down and doing this covenant with Abraham. They knew God was going to bless them. They couldn't seem to just fully trust him to do that without like grasping and cheating and manipulating. And that is the family that Joseph is born into. And if you had to hazard a guess, which sister do you think is Joseph's mom? It's Rachel, the beloved one. And Joseph was her firstborn son. And the Bible also tells us that Joseph was born when Jacob was in his old age. And so Jacob just explicitly says, Joseph is my favorite. Like he doesn't pretend otherwise. He doesn't keep it a secret. Joseph is his father's favorite. And he doesn't just say that. He actually gives him an ornate robe, which if you were living in a culture where you maybe had like 1 to 3 outfits at a time, a very ornate robe was a very lavish gift, and it was very loud. It was very obvious. And so it would be like parents, if you had your kids and one kid got this really fancy bedroom that they got to decorate themselves and fill with all their favorite toys and gadgets and all the things, and all the other kids were like sharing one white room with like maybe a window. Like they're alive, like they're fine. Or is there going to probably be some jealousy and tensions? Probably. I feel like that might happen. So Joseph's brothers, most of whom are older than him, I just really hate him. They just hate him. And to be fair, the first thing that the Bible tells us about Joseph is that he went to go check on his brother. He was herding flocks with his brothers, and he went back and told his father a bad report on them. That's the first thing we learn about Joseph, is like he's telling on his siblings. And so there was just a lot of tension between them. And if being his father's favorite wasn't enough, Joseph also had the special talent of having really vivid dreams. And in that culture, and even sometimes today, dreams is how God talks to his people. And so Joseph begins to tell his brothers and his family about his dreams. In his first dream, they're all thrashing wheat, and each of them has a stalk of wheat. And Joseph's stalk kind of starts to rise up, and all the other 11 bow down to it. And then Joseph has another dream where literally the sun, the moon, and 11 stars, the same number of people in his family, bow down to his star. And he tells his family this, and there are a lot of feelings. Even his dad, who loves him so much, is like, do you think your mom and I are going to bow down to you? And Joseph at this point is like 17, and like there are some 17-year-olds in the room. God bless them, and God bless you parents who are raising 17-year-olds. Sometimes it's hard for us when we were 17 to think about how our words and actions would affect the people around us. So Joseph was just out here giving everybody a lot of feelings. And things kind of come to head when Joseph's father sends him out to check on his brothers again when they are herding flocks far away from the house. So this 17-year-old kid goes out to check on his brothers because that went so well last time that he brought a report back to his father, but we're going to do it again. And this young man rolls up to his brothers in his ornate robe. Now listen, I have a real specific picture in my mind of what this looks like, and it involves one of our City North kids named Jackson. Ashley, thank you for letting me share this story. Maria, if you want to put that picture up there, this is Jackson King from a couple years ago. I have known Jackson since he was 2. This kid, there's not been a day in his life that he has not deeply cared about his clothes and how he looks and how he is presented to the world. And there are usually accessories like hat, sunglasses, jacket, extra shirt. He really cares about matching, not just colors, but also brands. You cannot cross Nike and Reebok, unacceptable. He just really cares. He cares so deeply. And he has been like this since before too. And the other thing that Jackson loves is he loves his rides. So he has his mini car, he has a bike, he has a scooter, he has all the things. And they just happen to live 4 doors down from the church. So y'all have probably seen Jackson rolling up, looking exactly like this. And when Jackson is rolling up in his full-on accessories in the car, you can't tell him nothing. Like, listen, you cannot tell him nothing. He is just living his best life, and he just thinks that he is the best thing out there. And in some ways, he is true. But that is how I picture Joseph rolling up to his brothers. And like, maybe that's not fair. Maybe Joseph was like super chill. But I'm gonna guess his brothers did not interpret his entrance like that. I'm gonna guess this is how they saw their little brother rolling up to check on them on the flocks. And in fact, the Bible tells us that before Joseph even gets to them, they're already plotting how to kill him. They're like, look at this dreamer coming. We have to do something about him. But while they are debating, are they gonna kill him? How are they gonna kill him? What are we gonna do? A caravan comes by who is going to Egypt to sell goods. And so they decide, instead of killing him, they're gonna do the way nicer thing and sell him into slavery. Human trafficking, clearly above murder. They just want to be rid of this kid. And so that's what they do. And as they're passing him off, they take his ornate robe and they dip it in blood, and they take this robe back to his father and tell his father that Joseph was killed by a wild animal and he is no more. So they have sent Joseph off to be human trafficked, and they have told his dad that he is dead. And so this family that is supposed to become the nation that is the start of God's rescue plan for all of mankind is totally blown apart. The favorite son is on his way to Egypt, and Jacob, his father, who is the grandson of Abraham, who is supposed to be the father of many nations, the father of fathers, he is left completely bereft. He refuses to be comforted by any of his other children, and he's basically like, I will see my son in death, and I don't care about anything until then. And so that is the state of God's rescue plan at this point. And things really don't get any better for Joseph when he goes to Egypt. Once he gets to Egypt, he is purchased by an official in the house of Pharaoh as his slave named Potiphar. And very quickly, Potiphar notices that Joseph is very skilled. He has a lot of administrative skills. He's very hardworking. And Potiphar notices that God is with Joseph in whatever he does, and that God blesses whatever Joseph touches. So Potiphar puts Joseph in charge of his whole house and is like, you got it, I can rest easy. Thanks so very much for doing all the dirty work of managing my life. And so Joseph has now risen above his station of being just like a regular slave. But the Bible tells us that Joseph was well-built and handsome. AKA Joseph's like a total hottie. Like, they talk about how hot Joseph is like so many times. He is very attractive, and it does not take long for Potiphar's wife to notice how attractive Joseph is. And so when Potiphar's wife tries to get Joseph to have sex with her, he refuses, and he says, I don't want to shame my master that way. I don't want to go against God that way. And he runs away. But once again, she grips onto his cloak, and he just like leaves it behind. So she just has his cloak. And so when Potiphar comes back, she tells him that Joseph tried to rape her, and Potiphar believes her. So he throws Joseph into prison where all the royal prisoners are, and Joseph is now in a worse situation than being human trafficked. He is now a slave in prison, essentially. But once again, the Bible tells us that God was with Joseph in the prison. He continues to be a hard worker. He continues to be trustworthy. He continues to use these administrative skills that God gave him. And the warden very quickly is like, oh, I can put this guy in charge, and I don't have to worry about anything anymore. And so he puts Joseph in charge of the prison. And while Joseph is in charge of the prison, there's another special skill that God has given him that comes into play again, and that is his ability to interpret dreams. So while in the royal prison, the royal cupbearer and the royal baker end up there. They did something that made Pharaoh mad, and Pharaoh threw him in jail. And they're kind of all in there together for a while. And one night, the cupbearer and the baker both have really vivid dreams. And the next day, they're kind of sad and stressed because they feel like this dream is supposed to mean something, but there's no one there to interpret it. And Joseph's like, well, I'll give it a try. Like, with God's help, I might be able to interpret your dream. And so they tell Joseph their dreams. And Joseph says, Baker, unfortunately, your dream means that Pharaoh is going to execute you in 3 days. Cupbearer, however, your dream means in 3 days, Pharaoh is going to restore you to your position in the palace. And when he does, will you please remember me? That's Joseph's one request. Will you please remember me when you are restored to the palace? And that's what happens. 3 days later, the baker is executed and the cupbearer is restored to the palace. But he forgot about Joseph. He forgot about the young Hebrew boy who helped him in prison. And 2 whole years pass. So now we're years into Joseph being in prison for something he didn't do. He thought he had a glimmer of a way out, and that's been snuffed out. And he is still in a foreign land because his brother sold him to slavery. This is a son of God's chosen family, and he is seemingly getting punished over and over again for doing nothing wrong. But one night, Pharaoh himself has some dreams. He has 2 different dreams. In the first dream, he is standing at the Nile River, which is this huge river in Egypt, and he sees 7 healthy cows come out of the river. But then he sees 7 gaunt, starving cows come out of the river, and they basically consume the healthy cows. And he wakes up and he's like, oh, that was weird. Okay, going back to sleep. Goes back to sleep, has a second dream. And in the second dream, he sees 7 stalks of wheat come up that are really healthy and beautiful. And then he sees 7 dried, parched, dying stalks of wheat come and consume the healthy ones. And by the next morning of not getting any sleep, he is determined that he is going to find someone who can tell him what these dreams mean. And he calls all the magicians and all the wise men to his palace, and no one is able to interpret the dream. And this is where the cupbearer kind of starts to have some deja vu. And it's like, I think there's someone who can help you. And so he tells Pharaoh about the Hebrew boy who helped him in prison interpret his dreams. And so they pull Joseph out of prison, they clean him up and take him to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh tells Joseph about his dreams, and this is the conversation. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered because the famine that follows will be so severe. So since Joseph has Pharaoh's ear anyway, he goes ahead and says, hey, Pharaoh, this is what I think you should do. God has told you what he is about to do. This is what I think you should do in response. You should gather 1/5 of all of the crops that are grown during the 7 years of abundance, and you should store them away so that when the 7 years of famine that are going to be worse than the 7 years of abundance come, there are storehouses for people to still eat, and your entire nation won't die. And Joseph tells him, you should put one person in charge of this. You need one person in charge of this special project to kind of unite the whole nation. And Pharaoh's looking around being like, yeah, that's a good idea. I want to do that. Give me somebody who has the Spirit of God in him. And he looks around, and Joseph is the one who just, with God's help, interpreted his dreams. And so Pharaoh puts Joseph in charge of that job. And not only does he put Joseph in charge of the job of like collecting food and building up these storehouses, he puts Joseph second in command of the entire nation of Egypt. There are chariots and parades. Joseph is now not only risen above his station, he is now second in charge of one of the largest nations in the world at the time. I remember when Joseph's brothers called him that dreamer in a derogatory way right before they sold him into slavery. Now that gift that God had given him is helping Joseph not only rise above his circumstances, but helping rescue an entire nation. And what God showed Pharaoh did happen. There were 7 years of abundance, and Joseph was in charge of the efforts to store that food. But then 7 years of famine arrived. The start of 7 years of famine arrived. And the famine did not just stay in Egypt. It spread everywhere in the known world, including to Canaan, where Joseph's family was. And Joseph's father learned that people were going to Egypt and getting grain, and there was actually grain there, and they were able to buy it and bring it back. So he sends his 10 older sons to go buy grain. But who do these 10 sons have to buy grain from? The little brother that they sold into slavery and told his dad was dead. So when Joseph's brothers arrive in Egypt, they don't recognize him. It has been years. The last time they saw Joseph, he was like 17 years old, and now he is a full-grown man, speaking a different language, second in charge of all of Egypt. If I'm being honest, his brothers probably thought he died a long time ago, even though they had only sold him into slavery. They probably thought he was dead. But Joseph recognizes them. And when they try to purchase grain from them, there is this long back and forth between Joseph and his siblings. He asks them some probing questions about their family back home. He's trying to see if his father is still alive, is his little brother still alive? And then he actually tricks them into thinking that they stole a royal artifact so that he could test them and see, like, are they going to betray each other like they did me? Are they going to throw each other under the bus? Or are they going to be righteous and honorable? And eventually he puts one of the brothers in jail for stealing this thing that they did not steal, but he does give the rest of the brothers grain. And so 10 brothers set out from Canaan, and now only 9 are going back. And he tells his brothers, if you ever want to see me again, if you ever want to buy more grain, you have to come back with your little brother. And there is a whole lot in that back and forth. It's like multiple chapters worth. So that is where I would encourage you to go back and watch the YouTube series about it, because there's a lot of really fascinating things in there that we do not have time to get into today. But this story of them going back, they're like, you know what, we lost another brother, what are we going to do? But eventually they run out of grain again. And eventually it gets to the point where Joseph's father has no choice but to send all of his sons back, including his youngest Benjamin. And at this point, he's like, God, please kill me. Like, I have lost half of my sons now. Like, who knows who's going to come back from Egypt? Sons just keep disappearing. I am ready for death. Like, God, just take me at this point. And the brothers get back. They show him Benjamin. Joseph and them have a little bit more back and forth. But eventually, Joseph reveals to his brothers who he is. So here's this man who is favored by his father, but that led to him being betrayed by his brothers and forced to live as a slave in another kingdom, rising above his circumstances, then losing it all because of something he didn't do, and falling lower than he was before, living in prison for years, forgotten, thought dead. And that does not look like the path you would think would lead to someone becoming the second in command of Egypt. That does not, A plus B does not equal C in that scenario. And it certainly doesn't look like the path that you would think God would give someone in his chosen family as a part of the rescue plan. Like, how does this further the rescue plan? And what do we do with that? What do we do when the path doesn't match the plan? What do we do when the steps in front of us don't match what we think God's heart for us is? We've already seen that God's plan was for creation was for him to abide with them in a beautiful garden, and that didn't last very long. God told Abraham that his plan for his family was to make them into a great nation, but Abraham had one son of promise, and they had to wait decades for it. And just as Jacob's family was settling into the land God had shown Abraham, settling into Canaan, their lives are disrupted. Their family is blown apart. One of the kids is ripped away to Egypt and thought dead. And Joseph, everything about his life in Egypt feels like he keeps doing the right things. He keeps trusting God. He keeps listening. And there's just detour after detour after detour. We think God's heart to us is kind. And Jesus told us he came that we could have life abundantly. And the Bible tells us that God works all things together for the good of those who love him. But sometimes the circumstances of our lives, the pain, the confusion, the waiting, the consequences of other people's actions, they don't match up to the good plan that God has for us. But here is how Joseph summarizes his path so far. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there would have been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there will be no plowing and weeping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it is not you who sent me here, but God." Joseph didn't look at the path he had walked as something that was done to him. He saw the bigger picture of what God was doing in his life. He didn't just focus on his lower story. He saw the upper story that God was writing. And after Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, he tells them that he is going to bring the entire family to Egypt and give them the land of Goshen, which is a very fertile part of Egypt, and their family is going to get to live out the famine there in safety. And they send for his father Jacob, and father and son are finally reunited, and it is this beautiful picture of reconciliation. But there's also this other element to Joseph's story. In the upper story of God's rescue plan, it doesn't make any sense to take Jacob's family from living in the land that God had given them to move them to Egypt. Why did we need this detour? But if God hadn't moved his family to Egypt, they would have all died during the famine. And the way he moved his chosen family to safety was by using the horrible circumstances that Joseph had to endure. God's rescue plan for mankind needed this path of rescue during this famine for that generation. And God's chosen family is going to end up in Egypt. And as we are going to learn about next week, there's going to have to be a whole other rescue path to get out of Egypt. But that's what that generation needed in that chapter of God's rescue plan. God is going to preserve this family even when they don't get it right all of the time. The upper story rescue plan is going to keep going. So what do we do? What do we do when the steps in front of us don't match what we think God's heart for us is? When our path doesn't seem to match God's plan? I think we need to focus on God's plan instead of our path. Whether our path is crooked because of choices that we have made and regrets, or because we are living with the consequences of other people's choices, the path we see is not the entirety of God's plan. We can see only the steps in front of us, and sometimes it does not feel like we can even see that. It doesn't even feel like we can see one step in front of us. But God's plan is bigger than the confines of our life and our circumstances, and even bigger than the confines of time. And we cannot see that. So we have to work to remember that God can use our crooked path to move his good plan forward. We have to be patient until we can see more. We have to trust God's plans are good and his heart is kind. And that doesn't mean we have to lie about our pain. That doesn't mean that we have to pretend that it doesn't hurt. The Bible is chock full of mourning and grief and hardship and crying out to God about the pain that we are in. But we can do both. We can trust in God's plan and grieve over the path that we have to walk. The other thing I see in Joseph's telling of his own story is that sometimes the path we walk isn't just for our own good. In the very last chapter of Genesis, Joseph is reassuring his brothers that he is not mad, he has forgiven them for their betrayal of him, and that he is going to take care of them even after their father has passed. But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Joseph is looking above the path he had to walk. He is looking to the upper story, to God's greater plan. And in the upper story, seeing the journey he had to walk led to the salvation of many lives, entire nations. Sometimes the paths that we have to walk are not just for our good or for the good of our people. They are good for the people and places around us. And that is why before every service, this team who is serving that morning, we have a huddle, and our chant is for Sunbury. Because we don't do this service for ourselves. We don't do this service just to serve ourselves. We do this service for the good of the people around us, for the good of our community, and to change lives for eternity. And that is why, as a church, multiple times a year, we pause a regular Sunday morning service, which is a thing I think a lot of us really like. But we pause that, and we serve people outside of our walls, whether that is in Sunbury or Haiti or somewhere else around the world, because it isn't just about us. We want to be a part of God's plan for this world, not just paying attention to the path he has us on. We want to be a part of the upper story, and sometimes that means getting out of our own way. Sometimes that means our path is for the good of other people and not just for ourselves. We don't want to focus only on our path. We want to be a part of God's plan. So that's where the story ends today, with a detour of God's rescue plan to another country, with a path of pain and discouragement. But this detour actually kept God's rescue plan going. It preserved his chosen family and saved the lives of many. And God can do that with our detours. He can do that with our crooked paths. And he can still use our paths as a part of his rescue plan and for the good of many. Let's pray.